Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this first in a series of webinars under the European Health Union initiative. My name is Dimitra Pantelli, and I work with the European Observatory on health systems and policies in Brussels, and it's a privilege to be your moderator for today. We are delighted to be organizing these webinars jointly with our colleagues from the European Health Forum Gastein under the European Health Union initiative, as I mentioned, and to be joined by 5 distinguished speakers today and all of you to discuss how we can harness our strengths to ensure better health for all in the European Union and in Europe as a whole. Today, we will focus on the potential of joint purchasing for pharmaceuticals and other health technologies beyond emergency countermeasures. But before we start, perhaps a note on the notion of the European Health Union that most of you will have heard of, or perhaps not. And for those of you who may not have heard of it, you will have perhaps reflected on the fact that there might have been a stronger role for the European Union in matters of health. This idea was being discussed before the pandemic, but it clearly gained traction during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And then in the 2020 State of the Union address, the Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, actually called on Europe to learn from the pandemic and to embark on an effort to strengthen a European health union. This would entail gathering the strengths of the EU member states to overcome individual weaknesses. And to achieve that, the Commission is already working with the European Parliament and the Council and has put forward a set of proposals. The first one focusing on emergency preparedness, on strengthening the legal framework behind that and strengthening the role of relevant European Union institutions such as the ECDC and the EMA. However, if we think about the range of potential applications of a stronger European health union, this is quite broad, and a number of stakeholders have brought forward ideas and concepts of how that can be achieved. And one of these groups, led by former Commissioner for Health and Food Safety, Vytenis Andriukaitis, is behind the European Health Union initiative and a manifesto that showcases the goals and the principles and potential measures that could lead to a European health union. And if we think about the goals is that as they are presented in the manifesto of the European Health Union that I'm sure my colleagues will be sharing in the chat box for you. We have to think about health and well-being, leaving no one behind. We have to think about strengthening solidarity, but also health security for European citizens, ensuring environmental sustainability and having a closer link to One Health, and also ensuring that everyone's voice is heard when policies are being formulated to move in this direction. So this is the background to the European Health Union, also to understand the context of the discussion that we will be having today. How can we work together? How can we harness our strengths? And what we would need to change, perhaps, in the European regulatory framework or beyond that to actually make that happen successfully in the future. So we today focusing on the issue, as I said, of the joint purchasing of pharmaceuticals. We are harnessing both the experience of the pandemic as recommended by the Commission's President, because we had during the pandemic a number of joint purchasing activities at the EU level. We had the advanced purchase agreements for COVID-19 vaccines funded via the emergency support instrument. We also had the joint procurement of a number of other types of technologies such as ventilators, but also COVID-19 therapeutics. So we have a lot to learn from. It's that those were not the first experience of joint purchasing in the European Union. We had some experiences before the pandemic at the European level, but also through voluntary collaborations of different European countries. So we will reflect on those as well. So we have a lot to learn from, but also we have a lot to consider in how to make these lessons actually applicable, and how to make these lessons applicable in a way that they reflect the goals that the European Health Union would have. In repetition lies learning. So leaving no one behind, stronger solidarity, environmental sustainability, stronger security, and everyone's voice being heard. We have 5 very distinguished speakers with us today. We have Natasha Azopardi-Muscat, the Director of the Division of Country Health Policies and Systems at the Regional Office for Europe of the WHO. We have Richard Bergström, who has been Sweden's vaccine coordinator, also in the COVID-19 joint purchasing efforts, so brings also the perspective of the industry as the former director of FPA. We have Annick de Ruyter, who is Associate Professor of Health Law and Policy at the University of Amsterdam, and is also a signatory of the manifesto of the European Health Union Initiative, so can reflect on that definitely. We have Alexander Natz, who is the Secretary General of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs, that has also a background in researching international law, so quite a lot of that perspective as well. And we have Charlotte Roffian, who is an advisor on European affairs with the France Asso Santé, and the lawyer brings both the civil society perspective and the legal perspective, and we are delighted to have the five of them today here to discuss this very topical and important issue. A couple of housekeeping details before we embark in our discussion. You are one of the most important resources of this webinar as our participants. So we have the chat box at the bottom of your screens as usual. Please use it to interact with us and to interact, if you want, with each other. But primarily, I would say, to ask questions of our panelists that we can pick up during the discussion. We have a number of questions that we have prepared to kick off the discussion in the panel. And then we will move into an open Q&A session with inputs that you either sent us in advance, so thank you for that, or that you will be putting in the chat during the panel discussion. My colleague, Erica Richardson, from the Observatory's team in London, is here with us today with the very specific task of looking at the chat room to ensure that we don't miss anything that you would like the panel to reflect on. I think without further ado at this point, we can kick off our discussions. You will see that we have a slightly different approach as the usual observatory webinars, which is we don't have presentations. This is actually a panel discussion. We will start straight away with insights from our panelists. And I would like, Natasha, to start with you with the first impulse and ask you to share with us very briefly in 2 minutes your experience or your background that you bring with you to our discussion today on joint purchasing. I will ask the same question of everybody else, but we start with you. Welcome and thank you. Natasha, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dimi, and thank you for putting this very important topic together as the first of this series of webinars. I think for me, joint procurement has been something that I have been looking at with interest for several years. Today, of course, I now work as the Divisional Director for WHO Regional Office for Europe, and access to medicines is one of the units under my portfolio. But even prior to joining WHO, particularly at the time when I was working for the government of Malta and we had the presidency of the European Union in 2017, that's already 5 years ago, joint procurement was something we were looking very, very closely at. And intuitively, of course, I mean, there are so many good reasons why one has to look at joint procurement. Particularly, I suppose, when from like myself, you are from a relatively small country with a small market. But as therapeutics advance and evolve, size becomes very relative. And what perhaps was small only for very small countries a decade ago is now very different as we enter the realm of some of the newer therapies that increasingly target very small groups of people. Why am I again interested in this topic? I am technically leading within the WHO what we are calling our Oslo Medicines Initiative. And here we are really with the Norwegian government creating a neutral platform to bring together all the stakeholders to find what are the right solutions to ensure that all this good and wonderful innovation can reach all the persons who can benefit from them without hurdles, without delays, and without being totally unaffordable to some people in some countries. So this is why, for me, it is really important, because clearly pooled procurement, joint purchasing is one of the technical topics areas that we need to delve into going further. So that's kind of my introductory interest in the topic, and happy to go now into more details later on in the webinar. Back to you, dear Dimi.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And just to reinforce from my side for our participants who haven't been in touch with the Oslo Medicines Initiative yet, there are a number of very key webinars going on under that initiative as well. So keep your eyes out for them. Natasha, we move from you to Richard Bergström. Richard, why are you here? Thank you for being here. Why are you here?
Well, I'm here particularly to address later the very positive experience we had with the vaccines, but we'll come to that later on here. So with the exception of the vaccine procurement, where we actually did not use the EU joint procurement mechanism, but we used something else that I'll come back to. With the exception of that, I have not very good experience with joint procurement. In fact, I'm not aware of any medicines, if we focus on medicines, and particularly not new medicines that have been jointly procured using these EU mechanisms until we did it during the pandemic. Also with really mixed experience. There's a lot of media reports now about how countries are signing bilateral agreements and so on. And I think that's probably a sign that the joint efforts are not really working. But I also want to point out to all of us for this conversation that there are different variants of the same theme here. And you start sort of with the most centralistic and sort of top down, which is probably this vaccine procurement, where even if we use the SC fund a little bit, it's only a fraction that's paid by the EU, it's paid by the member states. But it's very top down, essentially, Commission taking over and buying doses for the member states. Then you have a bit more soft, and it's joint procurement, which is more bottom up. You ask the member states, do you want to take part? What volumes do you want? And so on. Which I think is one of the fundamental problems, particularly with countermeasures, but we'll come back to that. And then you have something which is closely related, which I call buying clubs, which we could have used, in fact, for the vaccines at the global level, but we didn't, where you sit shoulder to shoulder, strong buyers sit shoulder to shoulder and negotiate with their own money and their own logic and their own mandate. Then you have a weaker version of that, you can say, which is not to belittle it, but the Benelux, for instance, where you maintain, sort of national decision making, but you work together and you inform yourself before you negotiate. And also this horizon scanning initiative is to be viewed in that context, right? And then you have the sort of some other weaker sort of examples of where you collaborate, like on HTA collaborations, UNETA and so on, which is definitely not procurement, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the speakers here and people in the chat box are referring to these sort of softer alternatives, even if the headline really is joint procurement. Thank you.
No, thank you. And I think this was really also a clear disambiguation of different options, a little bit like a mini keynote, perhaps, Richard. So thank you for that. We go to Charlotte. Charlotte, your perspective on this issue.
The invitation. So maybe just a few words about where I come from, so that people can understand our point of view. So I represent an organization called France Asso Santé, which is an alliance of about 85 patients and healthcare users organizations in France. And we have been a member of IFA and the European Alliance for Affordable Medicines for many years now, so which is with them that we've been working on a European level as well as on a national level for a number of years now, with a specific interest on access to medicines. Because so our interest in joint procurement is not new, actually, and it did not appear with the pandemic. We had discussion with the French authorities before the pandemic about the opportunity to collaborate with other countries to negotiate the price of medicines. And we have been convinced for years that even for a big country like France, joint procurements and common negotiation could make sense, especially for the affordability of medicines, because negotiating together can help bring prices down. Because obviously for patients, the main issue is access to medicines, and access to the medicines which best suits their condition. So our interest is beyond the price of medicines, is whether joint procurements can improve availability of medicines also when you are in a situation of short supply, for instance, or even whether it can help patients from small countries have access to medicines when those medicines are not marketed automatically by pharma companies. And our interest for joint procurement during the pandemic started actually with the advanced purchase agreements for vaccines, so which are not technically joint procurements, but that's more or less in the same box. And we've been very struck by the lack of transparency of those contracts. We were not the only ones, obviously. And it was a huge issue for us because you know that trust is essential for vaccines and for people, citizens to get vaccinated. And we believe that the lack of transparency of those contracts and even more of the other contracts, joint procurement contracts that we can discuss later on, has contributed negatively to this trust in vaccines, notwithstanding the fact that those contracts on vaccines were technically a success, but transparency is definitely an issue.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think a lot of important points, and as you say, we pick them up again moving forward with our next questions. Alexander, we come to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. It's a very important topic, and let me first of all say that I think we would definitely have to differentiate between emergency and non-emergency situations. This is how we're having these discussions. I would agree that with the vaccines purchase, the Commission has done a good job. I think joint procurement, whatever you might want to call it, or whatever instrument is used at the end of the day was a joint purchasing exercise. I think that has been very successful, but it was a very unique situation. We didn't have a health technology assessment for those medicines, and it was jointly purchased. For all other medicines, we think that a joint health technology assessment is first of all a precondition before you getting to purchase something. You need to know something about the value, and that value assessment needs to be harmonized, because otherwise it's going on like going on a marketplace and buying something where we have very different ideas about the quality of the good, right? So I think it's very important that we're doing our job first to have a joint health technology assessment in place in Europe, which will come in January 2025. As we all know, we're going to discuss about that, and we think that is a very good development, that we're having one HTA for one product in Europe. I think by the end of 2030, we will have all centrally authorized medicines and some devices covered by that. So that's very positive. We are also very positive when it comes to Benelux. However, we have seen, and Richard mentioned that, we haven't seen too many engagement in joint purchasing exercises, neither in the Valletta group nor in Benelux. I think it's really important that we get it right, but I think any joint HTA effort is very important. Let me also mention very quickly here that we've seen situations, for example, like in Germany, where the bundling of the purchasing power to the what we call the GKVSV in Germany has also led some companies to left the market. We have more or less 10% dropouts. So when we talk about increasing access to patients, we have to factor that in. And we think for the time being, we should work on the joint HTA, get the joint HTA right, and maybe at a later stage we can talk about what can we take from the positive examples in the vaccines in terms of joint purchasing.
Okay. Thank you. I take the key point of joint health technology assessment. I think we return to the experience of the voluntary collaborations in joint purchasing of medicines for those of the speakers who may not know them, such as the Valletta Declaration or Benelux. So these are the acronyms or the words that you've been hearing. We come back to that. It's quite an important point in the next round or the round after. Anik, last but not least, give us your perspective on today's topic.
So I became interested in joint procurement in 2009 during the swine flu outbreak, because that was basically one of the first times that you really saw what a huge problem for European solidarity the joint procurement of vaccines could have. And we saw some countries that had almost all the vaccines and other countries that had none. And then afterwards, there was this offloading of vaccines when they were really maybe not even necessary anymore. And so I think that for me, you know, coming at it from sort of a research perspective, looking at the future of the European Union in the field of health, the issue of solidarity in this regard is central. And public procurement is a great case to look at that. So to me, European solidarity in the field of health is about risk sharing and redistribution. And I think that public procurement, so joint procurement of medicines in the EU is really one of the first areas where we can see a little bit a much stronger social Europe in the field of health, potentially, right? And so and I think it's important to have that kind of historic background of what happened during swine flu and compare it to what happened during COVID, because there were some people before Richard who was a little bit, well, I mean, is this been such a big success? Have these, but really what we've seen during COVID was amazing in terms of public administration. I mean, it takes a lot for countries to start working together, and the institutional buildup for actors to start trusting each other, to start working together. It takes time. And so to me, this is really the start of something. And I do see that the people know each other within the different administrations. We've seen now who has the talent, who you know, where is the expertise. And so I think that this is really the start of an institutional framework that really has a long way to go. And in the context of what we would like for the European Health Union, which is a much more holistic idea of what the EU can do in health, this issue of redistribution and solidarity is really key.
Thank you very much for this. I think it brings us very nicely in the second round of questions, because you said, Annick, this is the right time, right? So now we have a unique moment where we, let's put it very provocatively, we had to work together in the past 2 years. And through that, we know where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are. So, but it was not the first time necessarily. So let's think back to 2009, as you said. So the second part, the second question for the panel is a little bit more specific towards the things that most of you already alluded to. So we have a range of experiences, from the recent experience in the COVID-19 pandemic all the way back to 2009, and in between over the years to the difficulties, but also opportunities with the joint procurement agreement framework. So if you think back to all these different types of experiences that we have from your perspective, what can we learn if we think about the fact that we want to take joint procurement initiatives, or let's say joint purchasing initiatives forward? And Alexander, I come back to your point. First, we need to get HTA right, correct? Let's think for a second about what it is that we can learn from the past specifically, and you can reflect on individual examples if you want, that we should repeat or should not repeat. And I think we start with Richard this time. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Dimi. So a lot to say on this. So I think, you know, the vaccines joint procurement, which was in the form of advanced purchase agreements, can give some inspiration. It was a very specific situation, but nevertheless, I do think there's some learnings that we could take forward to some selected group of medicines, and not only countermeasures, I think. But I want to highlight a couple of things. I think the key features of this effort was the portfolio. Okay. It was to hedge the bets, pool the risks. I would actually recommend, it's not often I recommend reading a Commission communication, but the Commission communication from early June 2020, read that. And I'm sure the Commission had been working on that for a few weeks, and it was not something done on a coffee break. It's very well written, and it encapsulates the entire approach, right? And it was alluded to by previous speakers, the fact that you needed to pool the risks and you hedge the bets. And in fact, I can let you in on the fact that the majority of public health institutions in Europe and the majority of experts did not believe in mRNA. And if you would have asked them, should we buy them? They said, no, it's too early. They need to be developed first, and then we have to evaluate them. Now, we didn't follow that advice. The Commission did not follow that advice, actually. And now it's Moderna and Pfizer that are two big vaccines, right? So I think there's a lesson to learn there, is that particularly when it comes to these types of efforts, you cannot sit and wait for evidence forever. Because, and it's not only about coming later than the others, which is one element, and not having access, but it's also the fact that you wouldn't have made the investments. We wouldn't have these factories in Germany producing Pfizer-BioNTech's vaccine if it wasn't for the fact that the Commission injected some money and the member states put money on the table and said, we will buy this. And that contract was later on expanded dramatically. And as you know, we have secured volumes for this year and next year, and even for updated vaccines and so on, and we plan for the worst, right? So that bit was a little bit unique, right? But the other observation I'll make, and back to what Alexander said before about the need for HTA, well, in this case, we didn't wait for HTA. We didn't do any HTA, because for us, it was a no-brainer. And in fact, when I look at in my country, Sweden, I mean, everybody has the same price. On average, we paid 15 euros per dose last year, so, it's sorry, incoming call there. So I think, it's a no-brainer. And sometimes you don't, I've been a proponent of HTA for my entire career, as many of you know. But, let's wait a minute. There are some such obvious innovations. And you also have the situation with some of the orphans where, well, you do the HTA and it's not adding up, but you still need it, you still want it. You sort of overrule. Many member states have that situation where orphans are going in the separate track, So sometimes the HTA is interesting, but not really that critical. So I would table, the central thought that when it's so obvious that, everybody needs this, you can cut to that point of making sure that you have equitable access everywhere, right? And it's the same thing now with the antivirals, the ones we have now, Molnupiravir, Paxlovid, Sotrovimab, I mean, I don't think we need to do HTA on them, because first, there's only limited supplies, and we will give them to these people that otherwise might die or end up in hospital. So I don't need any HTA to make a decision. Unfortunately, the European procurement of those hasn't worked very well. And I must say that is not because of the companies not trying. I can say that, and I hope, I see David Earnshaw is attending here, I hope I don't reveal any secrets by saying how hard the companies have been pushing for trying to have a joint approach. And it didn't really work out. So I think there's really something to analyze afterwards. Of course, then, what's obvious innovation? What is that? Well, that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So
Yes.
there will be things where it's already disputed, but there will be technologies coming which is so obvious that we all need, and we all need them in all the EU. And that's what I think I want to take forward from the vaccine experience and build on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a lot of good points that we need to take on again later, as for example, when do we need HTA, or when can we perhaps start, or how do we differentiate the approach so that we do have at some point some certainty for the best meaning of the word when it comes to the evidence, as well as taking different approaches perhaps for different types of really urgently needed medicines, or replacing, let's say, or complementing national processes. So we come back, I think, to a number of these points in the discussion. So thank you, Richard. Anik, we come back to you. We heard, you signaled already that 2009 experience, I think, pooling the risks, as you said, was reflected in what Richard was talking about now. What is your takeaway? What should we definitely learn moving forward? Advanced purchasing agreements where let's say the European member states take on a bit of the risk for still developing or producing medicines? What is the lesson?
So I think the issue of sort of risk sharing, I think we're all in agreement that, particularly when we saw the great portfolios that all of a sudden all countries had access to, that this is something that is a clear benefit of joint procurement and sort of doing it together in the EU. And whether the specific regulatory structure for that is maybe not even the most important. What is very difficult is the issue of solidarity and redistribution. So where does the money really come from? Is it indeed, as a previous speaker said, is it put together by the member states, or does the EU have a central budget to purchase certain medicines where the business case basically is not as good. And I think there is where we can see, hopefully in the future, a little bit of a real social face of Europe, where the Commission can also not only look at have a budget to purchase and to think about redistribution based on medical need. And so I think so that's really where the challenge lies, I think, for the future, and where the member states have to think about subsidiarity for real in the field of health. And I think that the issue, because there's such a benefit on the area of, with regards to risk sharing, bringing down the price, all of these other great benefits in joint procurement, we might see a bit more also of those solidarity aspects. And we might see a little bit more of a sort of willingness for member states to indeed create the budget for the EU to take on a central role, and even allow the EU to start making some redistributive choices.
Would we? Thank you. I think I move on with this round. I'll come back to you later to discuss what would need to change in terms of the EU's regulatory framework to be able to do that, given the principle of subsidiarity, as you said, and a number of other issues. Alex, I come over to you. Alexander, sorry, what we learned from the experience so far, and perhaps also picking on one of the issues that Annick just raised about the possibility of bringing down prices if we purchase together, or the possibility of the EU perhaps already investing or paying from an actual budget for products that are not maybe otherwise, that do not otherwise have a strong business case. I think the industry perspective on those issues would be really valuable here. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, joint purchasing or joint procurement, I think it is very important to be discussed. And what I mentioned before, just to clarify, I mean, there's no doubt that in the vaccines, in the pandemic situation, nobody wanted to force the companies to go through an HTA procedure. It doesn't make any sense. We wanted to have those products. We're very much convinced about those products. We're making the right steps, bypassing the HTA. The point I wanted to make, and I consider it very relevant for the non-emergency type of situations, it's a normal process that you first look at what you got on the table, how good it is, what the quality is. I think people in industry expect that, payers expecting that, patients expecting that, they know about the value of the medicine. So it's a two-step approach, HTA first, outside of pandemic situations. Again, in pandemic situations, no doubt we don't need it, we can bypass it. Also, maybe for the therapeutics, right? We need it quick. We're convinced, we have a look at the data, and then we go for it. We go directly into joint purchasing. I think there are a lot of lessons learned. And I think, again, the Commission has been doing a very good job in organizing this exercise. And there has been some criticism about transparency and so on. I've seen those contracts published on the web. So, I mean, you can see there, I think there is transparency also to reflect on that. On access to medicine and pricing issues, I think it's really important that when we got such a system that we get it right, because even in the vaccines, you see that the uptake of vaccination, and of course there are different factors, but we had joint purchasing. You have 28.5% in Bulgaria being vaccinated. You have 82% in Portugal being vaccinated. Very different wishes. So we didn't get to the same stage of usage of the medicine. Again, it's a very unique situation. There are very different factors play into that decision. But I just wanted to make the point that joint purchasing not necessarily leads to access in all the 27 EU countries from one point to the other. And I would finally like to reflect on one point on the risk sharing. I think that's really very important, because we see more and more risk sharing contracts popping up, especially in the one-time gene and cell therapies. And I think that's very positive. Industry is giving guarantees to say, like, if that drug doesn't work for the next 5-6 years, I'm going to pay back certain amounts of money. We've seen those in the ATMPs. I would say even all ATMPs at a certain point in time had those type of outcome-based agreements. My experience, it's much more difficult to negotiate those agreements on a higher level, where you have all the EU member states. Even in Germany, to negotiate them with the umbrella organization is almost impossible, and it's done with individual insurances. So sometimes starting small is also helping to get those agreements on the table and to find common ground in terms of guarantees of outcome for medicine. So just wanted to make that example in terms of risk sharing. But again, just to close here, there are a lot of lessons learned which we should factor in for the discussions for the future in terms of what was done well in the joint purchasing exercise when it comes to the vaccines.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And when we get back to you in the next round, perhaps if you want, you can reflect on, without disclosing too much clearly, what it is that makes it more complicated at the higher level. Because I think for me, that is where we need to think about, if we would do that at a European level, which of these complications can we work towards? And I can imagine the evidence base is one of them, which brings us back to the joint HTA. But beyond that, I think also there might be a couple of others, but we will come back to that in a minute. Natasha, one of the privileges of being towards the end of the sequence in a round is being able to reflect also on what the previous speaker said. And we heard quite a bit about affordability, but also about availability and about access. And I think coming to you, you bring, as you said, a multifaceted experience now from the WHO, but also from your tenure as Chief Medical Officer in Malta, which is also one of the small countries that have additional challenges in negotiating for medicines. Over to you. What are the lessons learned, the main lessons learned from our previous experience?
Thank you, Dimi. So I think a few quick reflections. To my mind, there is no doubt that this joint procurement agreement on vaccines for the EU worked. And if you want clear evidence of why it worked, you just need to look at where I sit and make the comparison with the countries that are neighboring the EU, particularly some of the smaller countries that were not part of this, and the problems that they had, particularly earlier on in accessing the vaccines. So I think that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and that, to me, there, it's abundantly clear. And of course, this also begs then some reflection about how we would like to pitch joint procurement going forward. And we want to conceive it, of course, in the spirit of solidarity, but we also, I think, need to be a bit careful that we don't kind of build up just some fortress EU that then excludes everyone else. And in this sense, perhaps some of the baby steps that some of the sub-regional networks, such as Benelux, Valletta, Finosa, were taking, were already a good step in the right direction, where one was trying to find a balance between predictability of volumes, a larger market share, security of supply, removing some of the complicated transactional overheads, particularly for the smaller countries, but also having perhaps a little bit more of homogeneity, because one could envisage, for example, then more equity-based tier pricing coming in too, rather than a one-size-fits-all. And I'd like to reflect on where we are. I think Anik said we are starting. Yes, indeed. And everything that is new has its teething problems. And of course, procurement is just one part of the whole access to medicine process that needs to be thought of, from R&D to regulation, to then the dispensation, the supply, the uptake, the clinical services. Most new therapies are totally integrated and embedded in the environment, in the clinical environment, and you can't separate the two. So joint procurement on its own is not going to solve all the solutions, but it should not be discounted, particularly in the new therapeutic landscape we are moving towards. So I don't think that we can say this worked for the emergency situations, but we shouldn't consider it for other scenarios. Absolutely not. I think we need to look critically, and we need to say, okay, if I come to the Oslo Medicines Initiative, what are the three goals? Solidarity, transparency, sustainability. How can we improve on what has been done so far to ensure that we can better achieve those objectives? And if, for example, one of the steps in the process is to go for a more sub-regional approach at first, that could be something to be considered. But of course, why did Benelux, Valletta, Finosa not perhaps progress far enough? They didn't have what was happening with the vaccines, which is to have the whole machinery, legal and otherwise, of the European Commission behind them. So I think we need to think further. And it reminds me a little bit, for example, about the evolution that we saw in regulation. There was a time when we had all the authorities doing national approvals and assessments. Then came the MRP, where more and more groups of countries were coming together. And now I am old enough to remember the discussions 20 years ago when the centralized procedure was being introduced. And again, the skepticism, the caution, the tendency to want really to limit it to specific situations. 20 years later, thinking back to those discussions at the EBSCO Council meetings, I laugh. And this is what I'm hearing again now with the joint procurement. I'm hearing, oh, but it can only be very limited. And what I think is it needs to be stepwise. Joint procurement clearly is not for all situations. But we're coming up to Rare Diseases Day on the 28th of February. There will be a high-level event under the French presidency. And of course, joint procurement has to be on the agenda when we're talking about rare diseases. There are no two ways about it. When we look at the therapeutic landscape ahead, and when we look at rare diseases, for example, to me, it is clearly one of the things that we need to consider. But as anything that is new, there are steps to be taken to improve it. And I think that my plea would be not to leave out the neighboring countries, particularly, for example, we look at the Western Balkans, some very small countries. We look at the Eastern Partnership where they still lack some very important capacities. And yes, I would like to understand perhaps Alexander's point better about what becomes more complicated as we coordinate more. Of course, there are differences, different legal regimes, many differences. But when we think of the sheer planning, monitoring that needs to get into place with the real world effectiveness, for example, I bring in here also the European health data space. Clearly, these are all instruments that we need to keep into account as we look forward. But for me, I don't think the door is shut on joint procurement and that we should leave it only to pandemics and emergencies. I think it's a question of how we refine this and how we really set up the work streams. And I do hope that after June, after our high-level meeting, looking more closely at pooled and joint procurement could be one of the work streams that we also take forward with other stakeholders and with industry, because clearly we need to do this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And just to ask you to keep that thought, because the next question is going to be, what can we do this for? Also, which technologies and also under what preconditions? And I think we will reflect on that a little bit differently. Alexander, I'm not going to come back to you directly, even though Natasha asked for a clarification. We come back to you in a moment because we still have Charlotte who hasn't spoken. And it's very important to hear from you as well, Charlotte. And then we move on a little bit. Mindful of time, short, please, because we also need to have some time with our participants.
You raised 3 points, which have been mentioned already. The first one is about connection between HTA and joint procurement. For us, there is nothing like obvious innovation. Doesn't mean anything, you know. And certainly the situation of the advanced purchase agreements for vaccines were exceptional because of these incredible needs, which was at a global level. But certainly there needs to be a strong connection between common evaluation, common HTA, and joint procurements in order to be in a position to evaluate the added value of the medicine you buy. You can't buy, you know, a medicine with closed eyes, and it wouldn't make sense. So joint procurements would not be useful in this case. Second point is solidarity, and I cannot agree more on the fact that certainly the main advantage of joint procurement is solidarity among European countries. And I believe that this solidarity is coming short now. For instance, when you look at Paxlovid, so the Pfizer antiviral, we heard news about a negotiation of a joint agreement, a European joint agreement, already at the beginning of January. We are mid-February and we still don't have any joint agreement, while we know that big European countries have been buying huge quantities of these products, leaving nothing or very little for the rest of the countries. So I believe that solidarity among European countries is fundamental. And one of the big differences between the advanced purchase agreements and the joint procurements is that in the advanced purchase agreements, European countries could not get supply based on national contracts before the supply of the whole European Union based on this advanced purchase agreement. And I believe that's one of the points on which we need to reflect. There cannot be a European negotiation and national negotiation at the same time, because when it does, it doesn't work. And the last point is, again, transparency. I believe that what we need now actually is a thorough evaluation of the contracts which have been concluded and what worked and what didn't work. But we still have very little information. So we had an insight into the advanced purchase agreement negotiated for vaccines because of the huge push of civil society and the European Parliament. But still, we know very little, if not nothing, about the ICU joint procurements which have been negotiated. Absolutely nothing. We know also very little about the negotiations and the contracts around antivirals or monoclonal antibodies which have been negotiated. So if we want to take stock of what has been done and improve the joint agreement process, we need to have an open evaluation of the processes, of the contracts, what worked and what didn't work. I believe that's the only way in order to go forward.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think this is actually a very rational way of looking at it. I mean, we've all here had our experiences with the previous attempts and successful, less successful, but perhaps a more systematic evaluation of those experiences could be helpful in moving forward. I think I'm going to deviate a little bit from the plan. So the final question to all of you is going to be, for which technologies beyond emergency countermeasures and under which preconditions can we actually start thinking about more joint purchasing? But before we get there, I will go to Erica, who has been keeping an eye on the chat, to give us a flavor of what is being discussed, so that maybe you can think about integrating that into your responses as well. In the interest of time, we won't manage to do that much more comprehensively. Erica, over to you. What's been going on?
Thank you very much, Dimi. Well, it's been a very active chat box, as we were expecting, and lots of people actually submitted questions ahead of time as well. So a lot of it relates to the role of HTA and whether a joint HTA process is a prerequisite for joint purchasing. So it'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts on that. But also how people rate existing joint procurement initiatives, the Benelux, the Valletta, and so on. You know, are there any success stories to be told from these earlier joint procurements? And what concerns or considerations might national governments have towards joint purchasing as the sort of, you know, not just industry and the health system, but the actual more broader government? But a lot of the debate has been around whether or not the impetus of the global crisis is central to the sort of joint procurement, and what are the prospects for joint purchasing for other than just sort of like niche solutions around sort of orphan drugs, or should it be limited to orphan drugs or generics or just vaccines? And for it to work, does the whole thing need to be much more centralized? And one last question, quick question. So will joint purchasing bring about price transparency? So that's a nice, quick, easy question for you as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this, exactly. Okay. Thank you, Erica. It's quite a lot. I think also perhaps difficult to reconcile. Some of it not, most of it not actually, with this last question of which technologies, and we've heard a little bit about orphan medicines, for example, from all of you, but now also from the chat and our participants. We heard about HTA as a prerequisite. I think we alluded to price transparency. I think Charlotte, with her insight on transparency in general, it's not just about terms, it's not just about process, but perhaps also price transparency. I think we go with all of these thoughts in mind, and perhaps with the thought, particularly for those of you who are most familiar also with the legal and the regulatory side of this, of what would be necessary for these incremental steps, perhaps, and when might be the right time to do that, to make them into the final round of reactions. And I think because we won't manage, because of time, to have a more active discussion, several of you have referenced someone else of the speaker. So if you want to take the option and the opportunity to respond, also that is fine. The impetus from our side is, what are the prerequisites specifically, and which technologies perhaps might be the ones to start with moving forward for joint purchasing efforts, and what are the externalities that we need to consider. So in this round, Anik, we start with you, perhaps as also our resident European Health Union Initiative signatory. Go ahead.
So yeah, you asked me before about the legal possibilities also to kind of bring this forward into the future. And as far as I've seen in the EU, it's, there's a lot of talk about the legal competence for the EU to legislate in the field of health. And actually, I don't think that's the problem. And I'm saying that as a lawyer. So of course, I like to say law is super, super important, but I actually think it's not that important in this case. So what is important here is policymaking, politics, political will, because there is competence here on this issue. We can find competence here in the treaties for sure. And especially because there's such a clear case for subsidiarity, which is of course one of the core principles on which the EU finds the basis to legislate. So I think that is really not a problem. What needs to be done to bring forward is to make that case for solidarity. So to go to that, so one of the research the research paper that we did a year ago that came out in the European Journal for Public Health, we looked at how do citizens like this kind of joint procurement mechanism. So what we did is we actually gave a number of policy options to European citizens in 5 different countries, and we asked them to give us their opinion about how much solidarity would you like to see in the area of joint procurement of medicines. So it's quite specific actually. And what came out of this is that generally European citizens like the EU doing this together, because I think it's obviously such a clear case of subsidiarity, and everybody likes access to medicines. Everybody can see that it increases the negotiating position when you buy stuff together. So for EU citizens, this is not such a big political reach, but it is important for the policymakers, particularly at national level. So that is where I think the focus of the politics should really be on. So the budget, the politics, and the policymakers, that's sort of where the critical hinges lie on bringing this forward. And then there's that issue of subsidiarity. And that really goes to the second question that you asked. So where should we focus on? What kind of technologies or medicine should we focus on? I think clearly you look for subsidiarity. So you look for those medicines where the common good is most increased, right? So yes, antibiotics, of course, there we see very little development. There's a clear business flaws in the business case, and of course also for rare diseases. So there are some very clear examples, I think, economically, which in the end is also, for a big part what the EU is about, where you can really get benefits from joint procurement. So I think look there, and to me, I would use as a critical decider this issue of subsidiarity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is very clear, making the case for solidarity and using this notion of subsidiarity also to inform which technologies make the most sense in that respect. Thank you. Anik, we move to Alexander. Your perspective, what is necessary beyond HTA and which technologies perhaps? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe first reflecting on the points which were made before very quickly, and what can it make more difficult if we have more people around the table on one side of the negotiation table? I would say simply it's about access to data, because usually when you have a centralized negotiation team, they don't have access to all the data, and that's very relevant when it comes to outcome-based agreements. Look at the Bluebird example. Everybody knows transfusion independence. It's about how can I measure transfusion independence, right? They had offered something like an outcome-based agreements to all the payers in Europe, I understand, which had one endpoint, transfusion independence. And that's not easy to be measured because not everyone has access to the data. Especially in Germany, only the individual insurances have access to the data. And I'm pretty sure that's the same in Italy and other countries. So it's about access to data to measure success. When we have a joint purchasing exercise, we might not have these outcome-based agreements, which are beneficial for both sides of the table. And the second thing about this one is very much about having too many people around the table doesn't necessarily always make it easier, because there's so many ideas coming in and so on. That's another point. What products first and what are the preconditions? I think we need to learn more and we need to take our lessons learned from the existing examples, first of all. I think we shouldn't rush into a situation. We should also take the lessons learned from the generics. I mean, they're jointly purchasing, not at the EU level, but at the national level for quite a while. We have seen competition decreasing. We've seen in some countries prices go down, but also we've seen companies going abroad to only manufacture in other parts of the world, which we now want to get back into Europe. So we really have to take a holistic view on things. What is the effect? We also need to take the look at the smaller member states. I mean, the bigger member states might get a better bargain by having a middle price, having a lower price from what they are paying now, but the smaller ones might have to adapt to that price and we might have a medium price. So I'm not so sure that everybody would necessarily benefit, because again, having too many people around the table, too many ideas doesn't necessarily make it easier to negotiate. But again, good lessons learned from the vaccines. We need to take them, put them in the perspective. But I think we need to hold on, wait, analyze. And as I said before, for me, outside everything of an emergency situation, we need to know something about the quality and the value of the good before we're negotiating. Otherwise, it's a bargaining exercise only.
Hey, thank you very much. Richard, we go over to you for your reflections.
Yes.
Which technologies, what prerequisites? Yes.
Yeah, so the first two quick reflections on what's been said. So on Alexander's point, we all know that just because you're bigger doesn't mean you get a better price. In fact, we see Norway, Denmark, at least in the beginning, they had the best biosimilar prices in Europe, I think. And why was that? Not because they were big, but because they were smart. So I think that's an important element. On solidarity that Charlotte came back to and several came back to, I think that this transparency could be improved on the whole process within the pandemic and the vaccines. When we analyze, what's happened, you will be surprised how much of solidarity, you'll be impressed with how much solidarity has been shown within the EU. We have been reshuffling doses between member states to east to west and north to south and back and forth to cater for the needs in each country. So actually that part I really welcome transparency over, because you will be impressed. Now I will answer this question, Dimi, by actually answering two questions or 2 points made by my friend Boris in the chat, because they sort of touch upon this. Boris is sort of warning for the risk of monopsonistic behavior. And he uses also the example from the flu markets around the world, So I think you need to judge the payers, or the buyers rather, by their behavior. And if you analyze now what happened with the vaccines again, is the fact that we did not just pick one. We did not pick one. We did not pick one mRNA. We picked all three. In fact, we had CureVac in the running as well. And later on, they left the race, you know. And why was that? Yeah, because we need choice. We don't know which one's going to be the best. We didn't pick a statin, you know, back then. And I don't think we will pick a statin today if that was a new class coming. I think everyone's learned. We've also learned that manufacturing is tough. I mean, who did that see that coming? That AstraZeneca in the beginning only delivered a quarter of what they should have under the contract. We had a contract and they couldn't deliver it well because they had problems with the manufacturing. So I think, you know, the buyers have demonstrated that we're not going to just pick one. We need choice. We need options. And we don't know which one is best. Okay. So I think the risk of commoditization is later, you know, when you come further into the market and you have many more suppliers. And that's the risk that Alexander raised on the generics. Fully agree with your assessment on having very thin, long supply chain. So I think the other observation on the behavior of buyers is that profit is okay. It's not cost plus. We did not insist on cost plus, not even development cost plus, because we knew BioNTech needs to deliver some money back to our pension funds that invested in them. So I think I would call upon all my former colleagues in the industry to reflect on this. You know, what behavior did actually the European buyers show dealing with these vaccines? It's actually, I would say, balancing affordability, cost control, solidarity, while supporting innovation, right? So I would agree finally with Natasha's more general statement. Let's have an open mind. You know, I don't want to pick therapeutic classes, but I can imagine that if you have a wave of innovation coming, which looks really interesting, you have no HTA, but everybody's really interested. 3-4 products, different approaches. Why not try something together? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Why not try something together? I think we can use that as a tagline. We go to Charlotte. Before going to Natasha, again, in the interest of time, as we are above our time limit, as brief and to the point as you have been so far, Charlotte. Over to you.
On what Richard just said. So it's not because you're bigger that you get a better price. And that's something I believe big countries need to think about. And especially in France, the attitude has often been, we're a big country, we get a better price. We do not need joint negotiation and joint procurement. And we need to reverse that thinking. And I fully agree with Annick, since I'm a lawyer myself. I don't believe law is everything. And I believe that we need a political will in there. And we also, I just want to say in the name of patients that, so we mostly work with French patients, but French patients don't want access at any cost at the expense of patients in the rest of the world. Patients now work together, are in contact in cross-border through patient organizations, and there is solidarity among patients also. So that's something our politicians and our administration need to keep in mind. I believe that's very important. What kind of medicines could be picked up for joint procurements, at least in a first phase? I believe that we should envisage or evaluate at least the option of joint procurement every time there are availability or affordability issues. So for drugs which are very expensive, which can be for some orphan drugs, cancer drugs, we now have many affordability issues with new cancer drugs, but sometimes also for very old medicines, which are just not produced anymore or in limited quantities, or for which there are shortages. Again, we need solidarity in order to share available supplies and find together solutions to improve production, like we did with vaccines, where the thinking about how to produce more in order to cover patients' needs was in conjunction with what has been done on joint procurement.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Natasha, the most difficult role of all. give us your perspective in this final round before we wrap up for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimi. And I know we're over time, but let me just say, I think the concepts of solidarity and subsidiarity should guide us, accompanied, yes, by transparency and sustainability. And on transparency, what I would say, it's beyond the price itself. This is about trust, about public trust. We want the public and the citizens to trust what we as public servants are doing on their behalf. This is extremely important. The second thing is around when does it work? Maybe it's something that needs to be time limited. It's not necessarily because I start a joint procurement initiative where there is uncertainty, where I need to bring capacity, where I need to bring data together, that it always has to be that way. So I think we really need to look at this is something that has to be good for buyers and for suppliers, of course, with the ultimate goal of having better access to patients, pan-European and worldwide. And this is what we are trying to bring to the table. There's a huge demand out there. We ourselves have a lot of latent demand, hidden demand. We now know what the pandemic has shown us is that it's not right that just because you live in some other country, if you're a child with a rare disease, you should not be able to access that therapy. And therefore, I think that the volumes could be much larger. And this is the conversation that we need to be having. And I think that the status quo is not acceptable and that we need to be able to improve access for all those who can benefit around the world, for all this innovation that is coming in many cases when there is uncertainty, where there still isn't competition. We are looking for better solutions. And joint procurement, I'm sure, has to be one of those solutions on the table. And I think we need to be bold to try different things and to try different approaches also for different therapeutic classes. We are learning. Let us have the humility to try to learn together, to course correct as we go along, with the ultimate objectives clearly in mind. Thank you very much, and back to you, Dim.
Thank you, Natasha, very much for this, and thank you all very much for your contributions. I think we had a really rich spectrum of points that have been raised, and I think even managed a discussion despite the time limitations. It's quite difficult to summarize everything. I know that our participants have been here already 7 minutes longer than they thought, so I will try to wrap up in a very brief series of points, clearly not capturing everything that we have discussed. I think the points that came across very clearly to me were that we need to learn clear lessons of the experience that we've had so far and grasp them in order to be able to move forward. And this relates to the overall results, but also to specifics for bigger countries, smaller countries, and also non-EU countries. The time is right now, based on the COVID-19 experience, to think about this actively and how we want to do this in the future. But it needs to be a stepwise approach where we think about both the how and the what. When we think about which technologies, we heard that perhaps when we have access issues, this be it because of affordability or availability, this is one of the guides, and the subsidiarity issue of where we maximize the benefit of the pooled procurement, such as the cases of antibiotics or orphans that were brought up, might be somewhere to start. But when we are looking at technologies beyond emergencies, it's important to have a solid evidence base, be that via HTA or available data systems, and perhaps the European health data space has a role to play there as well. And when we think about this discussion, it's not as much the legal issues that should be the focus, at least for now, but it's more an issue of political will. And I think the thing that came most clearly across to me today was that the stakeholder voices in this situation must be heard when we evaluate the lessons that we've had, all the stakeholder voices, if we want to have a successful experience moving forward. And we have, for instance, the Oslo Medicines Initiative that is going in this direction right now, but we should be thinking of these things in combination. We need to learn the lessons, we need to learn them well in order to be able to really create a situation when joint purchasing is a win-win for everyone involved. And I think with that, I thank everyone again, and also our participants. I hope that you will be interested in the future topics of this webinar series, which includes the workforce and others. And so looking forward to seeing you next time as well. Wish you a very nice afternoon and see you soon.